I suggest having a picture of yourself if you're the host and it's not about a certain business or whatever. If the reason you're doing the podcast is to add value and you are the main character in the podcast, I think having a picture of you on the artwork is definitely powerful. Podcast Growth Nation, welcome back to another episode of Podcast Growth University, where we talk all things podcasting all the time. I hope you enjoyed last week's episode number 97, I believe. Are you in the right category? We talked all about, there was a lot of numbers in that episode, but we talked all about the different categories, where you should place yourself, how to get the best exposure to the audience you're going after, all of that happy jazz. Today, for episode number 98, what makes good cover art? What makes a good logo? What makes good podcast cover art? That's what we're going to talk about. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, Kev, why didn't you do this episode earlier on? And there is a reason. Believe it or not, there is a reason. There is a method to the madness. The reason I didn't do this episode earlier on is because I don't want you to overcomplicate things in the very beginning and then not do something because of it. I would hate for you to say, right now I'm going to focus on getting everything done, and I don't have the best mic, and I don't have the best camera, and I don't have the best artwork, and I really need the best to get going. Because for a lot of us, we're never going to get to the point where we actually go invest in that camera, that microphone, that artwork. So I would rather put this episode later in time, where you probably, you might not yet, you might not have a podcast yet, but if you do have a podcast, you already have artwork, and you already have whatever you're using for a mic and whatever you're using for a camera if you're doing YouTube. You can always redo your artwork. That's why I wanted to do this episode later. Because when you become more confident, when you have a better understanding and idea of your show and the direction of it, when you have a deeper understanding of who you're talking to, you can change things up. So that's why I wanted to do this episode later in time rather than in the very beginning. Okay, so what is cover art? For those who might not know yet. When you go on Apple Podcasts, when you go on Spotify, when you go on all these different platforms, the cover art is the photo that you're going to see. It's going to be the first thing that you see when you discover a podcast. So if you go on the top 100 for Apple Podcasts, all of those squares that you see, that is the podcast cover art. I have unfortunately seen a lot of people who are really good podcasters who very clearly had messy action in the beginning, which I love, I'm all for, but they never fixed their artwork later. So there are some artworks where it's literally just a square that's like green, just like a green square with some very, very small lettering that says the name of the podcast. And it's just not eye-catchy. It's not going to draw someone in. I believe the stat is 62% of people said that if they like the cover art, they're willing to give the podcast a chance. They're willing to give it a listen. So what makes good cover art? One, well, let's say this. It depends on the category. I'm assuming most of you listening are either a small business, a personal brand. More than likely, you fall in those two categories. So good cover art is something that is bold. It is something that is eye-catching. It is something that is easy to read. It is something that is it makes it abundantly obvious what you're talking about, right? So let's say you had a podcast on cooking, and it was Chef's Secrets. That was the name of the podcast, Chef's Secrets. If you had a really nice, high-quality picture of a cheeseburger or a steak or a pasta dish, and you had Chef's Secrets in a really nice font, and everything was high quality, it's pretty obvious what that is, Chef's Secrets. And then you could even have a little subtitle on the bottom where we pull back the curtain on your favorite dishes, or we help you make restaurant quality meals at home. Again, it depends on the podcast. But when you came across that artwork, you would immediately know this is about food, and Chef's Secrets is a really good suggestion that you're going to learn secrets from chefs, right? It's simple, that simple. Somebody else might not do that. They might just have chef's secrets in bold letters, and they might not have any photo or any picture or any, I don't want to say, I guess, element. It doesn't necessarily have to be a photo, but a high quality photo would probably do really well. So that's one piece. You want it to be abundantly clear what you're talking about. So if you have a sports podcast, having a basketball or whatever might be super helpful, right? That might be something you want to do. Another thing that I've really, really come across is people don't really like to put their picture on their podcast artwork for whatever reason. I always suggest it. Do I have any data necessarily to back that up? No, not necessarily. But I know when I'm looking for podcasts, I like to resonate with the host. And do I listen to a ton of other podcasts? No. But when I have in the past, when I'm searching through podcasts, I like to look for a host that I see and it feels like I resonate with that person. So I'm a huge proponent of putting your actual picture, your headshot on your podcast artwork. Now, I realize that takes a certain level of courage and you're really putting yourself out there, but I think it's worth it. I really do, because I think it helps with branding too. So if you're going to put stuff on your social media, you're going to have pictures of you on social media. So you might as well have pictures of you on your podcast artwork. I like that approach. I think that's something that can set you apart. Because let's be real. How hard is it to go on Canva to type in podcast artwork and then just to take something that's already there, change the font, change the colors, change the name, and then produce artwork there? It's not super hard. So that means more people are going to do that and less people are going to take their headshot and bring it in and make sure it's the right size and make sure it's the right quality and make sure it's the right dimensions and all that. So I think if anything, it sets you apart. Again, it depends on your genre. But if you're in self-improvement, look at the podcasts that are doing well in self-improvement. Most of them have pictures of people. Business podcasts, like a Nike podcast, Trader Joe's podcast, that type of stuff, they aren't going to have a picture most likely because it's a business, not a person. It's not about one person. It's about the business or the brand. So they're going to have their logo on there most likely. Nike will have the little swoosh. Trader Joe's will have probably their logo in their title. I think it's, I don't remember the name of Trader Joe's podcast, but I'm pretty sure it has their actual logo because it's very recognizable. So that's a couple things to take note of. You want to make sure that your podcast artwork is 3,000 by 3,000 pixels. Now, again, you can do all this in Canva. It's the easiest it's ever been to do this, but you want 3,000 by 3,000 pixels. It's going to be a square, right? Our podcast artwork is going to be a square. And you want to make sure it's either a JPEG or a PNG file. Those are the only two that are going to be accepted. When you're changing it or you're doing this for the first time, if you get any error codes when you're trying to bring your podcast over to Apple, this is usually one of the more common ones because of the artwork. Because maybe the artwork isn't the right dimension, maybe it's not high enough quality, maybe it's not a PNG or JPEG. So those are some things to be aware of when creating or recreating your podcast artwork.
Hi, I'm Jennifer Hurwitz. So last year I wanted to quit everything. I wanted to throw in the towel. I wanted to hang up my microphone. And Kevin said no. Kevin said, keep going, Jen. You've got this. And oh my God, I'm going to cry. And I did. Coaches need coaches, y'all. And working with Kevin has been one of the best experiences of my life. Oh my God, I'm crying. Kevin, you are the best. I could not do this without you. And thank you. Thank you for being you and the amazing human that you are.
Another big thing is don't use font that's really hard to read. I know that you might have a flowery brand and maybe you have a very feminine podcast and a very feminine brand, but if you have cursive, it's probably not going to land well. Most people, well, I don't know, I'll speak for myself. I learned cursive in school. I couldn't tell you the last time I wrote in cursive. Yes, I can read in cursive, but it doesn't resonate with me. It doesn't catch my eye. The things that catch our eyes are usually really bold. It's bold and it stands out. So think about that from a color perspective too. If you have a white or maybe a black artwork with white letters, is that going to stick out more than white artwork with black letters? Or could you do a blue background with yellow letters, right? Think about it that way. Understand that this is going to be on a very, very small screen. So make sure when you test it out, you're looking at it in multiple places. If you test it out if you create it on your laptop and then you look at it on your laptop, it's going to look obviously a lot smaller on your phone. And a lot of people are consuming podcasts on their phones. So just make sure that you are taking that into account when you create it or get it created. There's Upwork, there's Fiverr, there's a million places you can get this done for probably relatively cheap. I don't know what people are charging, but I can imagine you could probably get one done for like $50 if I had to guess. So those are a couple ones. What's another common mistake I see? I would say the most common mistake is people just don't change it. They elevate their mic, they elevate their camera, they change the way they do the podcast, but they never change the artwork. Don't be afraid to change the artwork. The artwork has to be representative of you and your quality. I have realized that many people are not creating a positive account of themselves with their branding. And here's the other thing. If you're on YouTube, you want your header on YouTube and your artwork on YouTube to be connected to your podcast artwork, because that's going to be through branding across all of the different platforms. So don't overcomplicate it. I would say start very simple, start very bold, make it abundantly clear what this podcast is about. I suggest having a picture of yourself if you're the host and it's not about a certain business or whatever. If the reason you're doing the podcast is to add value and you are the main character in the podcast, I think having a picture of you on the artwork is definitely powerful. Don't use strange fonts because people, if they can't read them, they're going to move on and they're just not going to give you the time that you might deserve. This also comes to the question of, is it time to rebrand your podcast name? Again, there's a lot of people who, when they start, they think they have a really good name, and eventually things change, and they aren't that name anymore, and that's not the brand they're aspiring to be, and that's not the direction they're going, or they're not interviewing guests like they once did, or they are interviewing guests even though they did in the beginning. So that's another thing to kind of take into account. Your artwork can really only be as good as the name of your podcast. So that's another conversation. And again, I'd love to do an episode on what makes a good podcast title, but it's really hard. It's very contextual. It depends. It really depends on a lot of things. It depends on what your show is about. It depends on if you have a name that you can attach to it. It just depends on so many things. So that's probably a deeper episode, but just know that if you don't have a great podcast name, it's going to be really hard to make great podcast artwork. Doesn't mean it can't be done, but just as an awareness. And just use common sense. Just use common sense. If you were making a flyer for a business, how would you do it? If you were making a really high quality sign for a yard sale, how would you do it? Use common sense when it comes to stuff too, because I think sometimes we overcomplicate it. It doesn't have to be super complicated. If anything, the ones that I have seen that I would change are either way too complicated or there just wasn't a lot of thought put into it. So I guess it's either way too complicated or just not thought through simplicity. That's what I would say about that. But again, going through this, really thinking about this live in real time, if you don't have a good podcast name, it really limits you. It's really, 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 really going to limit you. One of the things that I give in terms of feedback for people all the time is you got to change your name. It sucks to say, I don't like doing it, but it is a common conversation I have because I'll say nobody knows what your nobody knows what that means. Nobody's going to search that. Nobody's really going to resonate with what that means. Nobody knows. Nobody really knows what that means. It's not clear. Even if I clicked on the podcast, I saw the artwork, I liked the artwork, and then I read the title, I wouldn't know what the show is about. And if I don't know what the show is about, how do I know if it's for me? So again, maybe a deeper conversation, but probably something to think about, just in case you're having that thought of, I don't know if this podcast name is serving me anymore. What else? What else would I say about good cover art? I think that's pretty much the basis. I don't want to go too deep, but you want your cover art to stand out. And you want people to see it, and you want them to know immediately what is going on. I think that's the best way to explain it. Let me see. Let me check my notes, see if there's anything else I wanted to chat about. Yeah, don't use a ton of words on your artwork. If you have a ton of words, it's just, again, it's going to be super hard to read. But yeah, other than that, I think you'll be off to the races. Go on Canva. Go check out Canva. Canva has a ton of different templates where you can literally just search podcast cover art, and there will be a ton. And you can drag and drop your photo. You can change the verbiage. You can change the text. You can change the colors. You save yourself a good amount of money if you want to test that out and see how it feels, see how it looks. Ask your friends. One of the things I see often, and be careful because I don't know if this is considered self-promotion, but in a lot of the podcast Facebook groups I'm in, people will put their artwork up and say, which one of these 4 artworks catches your eye the most? That's always a good way to do it. Ask friends, ask family, ask the people on your Facebook page, your Instagram page, LinkedIn, whatever, TikTok. Obviously, that's harder because it has to be a video, but so that's a good way to get feedback. Because that's the other thing too, is it's hard to know when you're so attached to it, right? You care about your artwork a ton because it's personal to you. And sometimes when it's personal to us, we don't really look at it from an unbiased perspective. So if we ever do a podcast breakthrough session and you want to talk about your artwork, feel free to bring that. I think that's always a really cool thing to talk about behind the scenes, because it's really hard to talk to an audience of people about artwork when you don't know what artwork they're using. So that's why I'm trying to stick to fundamentals in this one. And then I think the last thing, I promise, I would say, is just look at what's working for other people. Now, it's not a guarantee it's going to work for you. It might be working for them for different reasons, right? But it gives you a good idea of what's actually working. YouTube thumbnails are a really good example of this. There's certain things that work really well on YouTube thumbnails. And if you look at creators who are succeeding on YouTube, I'm willing to bet one of the reasons they're succeeding is not just because of the thumbnail, but they put a lot of time, energy, and effort and focus into creating the best thumbnails possible. So just if we use that as an example and we use that as inspiration, we might feel like we're more guided. We might feel like we have a better idea of where to go. So that is the last thing I will say about good cover art, I promise. As always, if you are struggling with growing or monetizing or becoming a better speaker, becoming a better interviewer, whatever it is, and you feel like you could use a little help, but you do not want to spend money to get that help, I am happy to offer a free 30-minute podcast breakthrough session to any of you. I don't care how many episodes you are. I don't even care if you have a podcast yet. I'm happy to help you get it off the ground. I'll have the link in the show notes as always. Next week for episode number 99. Can you believe we're almost at 100 episodes? That is mind-blowing to me. 3 more big interview mistakes I see. I know a lot of us start podcasts because we want to interview people. But I also know interviewing people can be very, very challenging, especially if you've never done it before. And most of us have never interviewed people before because our profession doesn't require it, and it's just not something you usually do. So we're going to talk about 3 more big interview mistakes I see, because I want to make sure you win. And then I'm very excited for episode number 100. I think it's something that's important to all of us. So keep an eye out for episode 100 coming in 2 weeks. As always, I hope your artwork is crushing it. I hope your intro, outro, and trailer are strong. I hope you're feeling more comfortable in front of the mic, in front of the camera if you're doing YouTube. I hope the guests are saying yes. I hope the hosts are saying yes. And I hope you believe in yourself more than you did last week. Until next week, keep crushing it, keep podcasting, and I will talk to you